welcome to the AI and Big Data in Finance webinar. We are delighted to have two distinguished speakers today. Cong from Cornell University will present his paper on antitrust and user union in the era of digital platforms and big data. Sockin from UT Austin is a discussant. As a reminder, will have 30 minutes for the presentation. After 50 minutes, we will briefly interrupt him to give the audience the opportunity to ask clarifying questions. Then Michael has 20 minutes for his discussion. Afterwards, we are going to open the floor for questions from the audience. As the audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A. I will then call on you during the questioning part. And as a reminder, please be respectful with your comments. The presentation and discussion will be recorded and together with the slides posted on our website. After the main part of the webinar, we will have an unrecorded discussion where everyone will be upgraded to a panelist and will be able to share his or her video and audio. The floor is yours. You have 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Markus, for the introduction. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. This is a pretty busy month, I think, for many of you. Today I just want to present a very early work jointly with Simon Meyer, who's joining HEC Paris in a few weeks. And the title of our paper, which we modified a little bit, is Antitrust, Regulation, and User Union in the Era of Digital Platforms and Big Data. We added regulation because someone was pointing out that antitrust and regulation are typically treated as separate items. So we're definitely dynamically revising the paper, and your comments would be very helpful. So just to start, what motivates us to look at this issue is something that has been ongoing for several decades. We do know there's the rise of digital platforms. We see big data, especially in terms of volume, in terms of variety and format. But at the same time, we also know that a small number of large platforms or companies that is traditionally have dominated the space and hold most of our data. There were issues of data leaks, Cambridge Analytica, so on and so forth. There are lawsuits against Google in terms of how, and Facebook, which is now Meta. There are definitely privacy concerns. At the same time, there's a number of privacy protection policies, as well as data sharing initiatives, such as open banking standards in the UK, and also just open banking in general in Europe and in the US, that are very much ongoing. There's a lot of debate on what is the more effective policy within the space. And if we push this a little bit further, there's also the evolution or revolution within the FinTech space. There's more requests for decentralization, peer-to-peer interactions, and part of this whole movement is that large platforms may garner market power that's hurting consumers, and decentralization is a way to reduce the intermediary rent. And this is actually quite related. But what we want to really highlight, or what we recognize, is that traditional firm productions or even platform service productions rely on capital, land, labor. You know, we've talked about intermediary inputs, intermediary goods as inputs, R&D and all that. But typically the focus hasn't been on users. But we do recognize that users actually contribute a lot to this production process through network adoption. Right? If there are positive network effects, one user's adoption of the network is going to increase the utility others are getting. At the same time, we do know platforms and firms use a lot of data that's generated by the users to improve their products and services, which in turn would affect other users or affect the quality of service that they provide. How do we regulate platforms or firms and make sure they are sufficiently competitive in the presence of network effect and data feedback effect would be quite crucial. Now, we're not the first one to look at this. There are a large literature on this topic. I don't have to mention the literature on network effects or multi-sided platforms. But more recently, we've seen people pointing out that data could have this feedback effect onto the platform. The more data you have, the better the quality of the service, the more users you attract, and the more data they will generate in turn. The focus have been on price discrimination or the return of scales. Laura Veldkamp and Maryam have done work on that as well. Safe to say that many models can generate either oversupply or undersupply of data, as well as oversharing or undersharing of data through various mechanisms. In the interest of time, I'm not going to review them one by one, but what we want to point out is something different from the literature, but at least not completely overlapping with the channels that have been pointed out before. So we do want to highlight the core features of a data economy. And what are the core features? First, there's non-rivalry. I've done some earlier work on this as well. This is not new. Many models already incorporate non-rivalry of data. So you can potentially sell or share data even with your competitors. We also know that byproducts of economic activities, so they are not separable from the data subjects, namely the users. And that's what's leading to privacy concerns, so on and so forth. That's not new either. Our discussant, Michael, has worked on data privacy quite a bit. I think 3 and 4 are something that we think are relatively new to the literature. 3 means we're going to model the fact that data are not only produced by individuals. Yes, my birth date and all that is my personal data that's produced by my parents, but a lot of the interaction data, the transaction data, are actually produced strongly by many users interacting, and the platforms are contributing in terms of infrastructure and the scenarios they create for users to interact. So platforms' effort or investment in infrastructure definitely plays an important role in data generation and collection. We also want to really capture the fact that data are decentralized, or information are typically decentralized when they are first produced. And if stay siloed, they are not going to have a lot of value. It's only in aggregate when we collect data that they can generate some useful information for improving the products. So we want to capture that dispersed nature of data. And as you see, we model that by specifying the users to be relatively small compared to the platforms. And our key insights or key findings is that users do not fully internalize the impact of their data contribution or sharing on other users. I think that's quite intuitive. They don't internalize the impact of data contribution on the market power that a platform is going to gain. And they also don't internalize platforms' incentive to invest in generating and collecting more data. And almost all 3 are due to the fact that users are typically very small and decentralized in nature. We're going to generate both over and under supply of data in the model. And we're going to use this framework to evaluate various policies, including GDPR, CCPA, data privacy regulation, data sharing initiatives, open data initiatives, so on and so forth. And towards the end, we actually want to model or provide a foundation for how a user union would work and how that's going to lead to the mitigation of many of the inefficiencies that we observe in the setup. So let me quickly mention the model setup. We try to have a simple model, as simple as possible with the necessary ingredients. So basically we have 2 platforms, A and B. They are competing for a unit measure of users. The users are heterogeneous. The way we model that is, you can view this as a hoteling line. So users are located in location Z, and Z is uniformly distributed between 0 and 1. So that captures some heterogeneous preference for the platforms. For example, if I'm originally from China, I might be more interested in using WeChat instead of Line or Signal or Telegram. So we do allow that. It's not going to be perfect competition. Production of the service has a cost that's normalized to 0. We assume users, each one only take 1 unit of service. And the price of that product or service is denoted by PTX. X indicates the platform, T is the time, depending on whether we're in the first period or second period. The first period can be viewed as an initial phase of the platform, and the second period can be viewed as a long run operation of the platform. We're going to use N to denote the measure of users adopting a particular platform. Here, we have assumed that there's no multi-homing. We know that's not true. In practice, users do adopt multiple platforms at the same time. In a sense, you can view NT here as the hours that users allocate to a particular platform. Right? There are only 24 hours, so in that sense, it's still limited. Each user is going to derive a utility given by YT minus kappa. So YT is the payoff or the utility that they get from the service directly. And kappa here just measures the transport cost, right? That's one way to differentiate the preferences among the users. The service quality Y is further decomposed into 3 elements. The first one is KX. That's just a quality level of the service of the platform. So 2 platforms could have different quality of the products or services. The second term is related to data. Basically, here I use a indicator function t equals 2 to denote the fact that if a platform has accumulated data in period 1, they can actually use the data to improve the service quality. And by how much? Well, that's given by this phi function. Phi essentially denotes how effective the platform is at processing data or using data to improve service quality. And the third term is our network effect term. So the more people there are on the platform, the more I benefit from the service. And the level of this network effect is given by this coefficient gamma that could be platform specific. And without loss of generality, we're going to assume platform A is weakly better than platform B in terms of processing data or using data to improve services. Let's close this. Okay. So data are byproducts of economic activities. So each user is going to generate E times theta. Well, actually, each user is going to generate E units of data, but they can decide what fraction theta to share with the platform, to contribute to the platform. And E here depends on the infrastructure that the platform provides. And we can view that as an investment in infrastructure or an effort that the platform exerts in period 1 to generate data. So E is the baseline, and we're going to endogenize that. So the cost for a investment E is going to be half lambda E squared. It just has to be a convex cost. It doesn't have to be quadratic, but we want to find an interior solution there. And I already mentioned theta is the fraction that individuals want to share with the platform. We use theta lower bar to denote the lower bound. If theta lower bar is 1, we go back to the traditional practice where the platform owns the data. All data are contributed to whoever is running the database, and those are typically platforms. But if theta lower bar is below 1, that means there's some discretion that the users exercise. This specification is going to allow us to capture various forms of policy or regulations. And we do assume that individuals incur a privacy cost, C, that depends on whether the data stay with the platform or is also shared across platform. If it's shared across platform, the cost is higher by a fraction of eta. Individuals also get a compensation QX per unit of data that they share. Q could be monetary, it could be also in the forms of perks. You have certain access to the platform or new products. So the net utility for each individual will be the quality of service or the payoff from consuming the service YT minus the price they pay, minus the transport cost, plus whatever data, net benefit data contribution is generating for them. So in period 1, we use D hat to denote data generated in period 1, and D to denote the total data available for period 2. The data available in the second period cannot exceed the data generated, right? That's true to the fact that data are byproducts of economic activities. So the maximum amount of data available in the second period is just the total amount of data generated on the 2 platforms. There's recall 1 denotes the first period, A and B denotes the 2 platforms. So the sum of data generated or contributed on the 2 platforms in the first period. And basically in the first period, the platform is going to set the amount that they compensate for data, the infrastructure investment E, as well as the price for the products. Then users decide which platform to use. And in the second period, 2 platforms simultaneously set the price. There's no further action. And note that our results will not rely on any stickiness of users. Users can switch between the 2 platforms very easily in this setting. And that's increasingly true in practice as well. The equilibrium concept is subgame perfect in pure strategies. The platform's objective will be in the second period, platforms are just maximizing the number of users and the price that they charge per user for the service. So that's the revenue in the second period. Now in the first period, the platforms maximize whatever they get in expectation from the second period, but also their first period revenue minus the data compensation they have to pay for accumulating data on the platform and the effort or investment cost for building the infrastructure for collecting data. So I don't know if I should take a pause to take any questions. If there isn't.
You can continue, Will. So far, we do not have any questions in the chat. Okay.
So I'll come back to questions in a bit. So I'll just continue to the characterization of the equilibrium. So the model is quite straightforward. Individuals are on this line segment is going to solve the indifference condition where they are indifferent between the 2 platforms. And the indifferent user is actually this given by this Z hat. What turns out to matter is not the absolute level of intrinsic quality or the level of network effects and so forth. Is the net difference. So what matters is a effective transport cost, is the transport cost minus average network effect. So if there's stronger network effect, effectively we have less transport costs. So that's not surprising. Another quantity that turns out to matter is the difference between the 2 platforms in terms of the level of quality and the network effect. And the rest are coming from the data sharing or data feedback effect. And that's what we want to highlight. So if we write down the first order condition, the second period problem is easy to solve. You see the product prices charged are some baseline level plus a difference in terms of how effectively the 2 platforms are using data. The gap between the 2 platforms is going to matter. This is the data gap. Remember, delta K is the gap in network effect of the baseline quality of service. So if A is the better platform, it can charge a higher price in general. The marginal user is given by the Z hat, which also corresponds to A's market share because we have a unit measure of agents. So the market share of A does depend on the difference of the data part and also the difference in network effect and baseline quality differences. Okay. Now the first stage is more interesting. When the platform is setting price, it cares about a static optimization of first period's revenue. At the same time, it's going to think about if I lower my price, how does that increase adoption? How does adoption increase data contribution? And how does data contribution contributes to my revenue? Right? There's the data benefit part. Of course, they have to think about the investment in data infrastructure, and that's going to have a cost. So that's the data cost. That's for setting price. Similarly, for thinking about the amount of investment, they are considering the impact of that infrastructure investment on the first period revenue, on the data benefit, as well as the cost associated. It turns out that the platforms essentially pass the compensation for data one-to-one onto the users. So they could compete in the perks they offer, but it's going to be equivalent to charging a lower price. So for simplicity, it's sufficient to focus on an equilibrium where the compensation for data is just going to be the minimum privacy cost that users experience. Essentially, they make the user break even. Why don't the users extract more rent while the users are infinitesimal? So they don't have any bargaining power in this setting. For a baseline, we consider the case where the platforms own data, and that follows the database directive. Essentially, who runs the database kind of by default are the owners of the data. In that case, what happens is with data feedback, platforms are going to compete more fiercely. So in the first period, the better platform actually prices lower because they're going to enjoy the data benefit. They also price lower than the second period for the same platform. But in the second period, the platform can really squeeze the users. So once I acquire all the users through subsidies, I can actually charge a fee, not because they have to stick to my platform, but because with their earlier data contribution, the quality of service has improved so much that people would prefer this platform. And also that's going to interact with the network effect. But we can set the network effect to 0. The data feedback effect is still going to go through. And the kind of market concentration for platform A is going to determine the difference in the data processing abilities and also the average importance of data in this economy and the average network effect. So that's going to potentially lead to a winner takes all or market power for platform A. Now, platform A's market concentration doesn't necessarily gives it market power, but in this setting, the better platform can actually charge a higher product price in the second period. So it's actually going to hurt consumers and users. In that sense, they are using the market power to hurt the consumers, and it's a concern for consumer protection. And even when the platforms are symmetric, there is a form of inefficiency in the sense that individuals are still not internalizing their benefit of data contribution. So even when the platforms are symmetric and competing very fiercely, individuals may still under-provide data, and the platforms may under-provide initial investment for data generation. And that's what we see in the model. If you look at the effort level, it's going to depend on how important data is, so on and so forth. And the key friction, so the key inefficiencies in the model is then individuals don't internalize how their data improve others' service quality or service experience. So that's that tends to push it towards the under provision. At the same time, if they contribute a lot of data to a particular platform, that's going to increase that platform's market power. That means there's a tendency, there's a force to over provide data. And also the platforms face incentives in terms of data infrastructure investment or effort exertion to generate data. So a simple data sharing plan is not going to solve the problem. That's going to lead to a hold up for the platform because they would lose the incentive to exert effort. And that's captured in this panel of figures. And if you look at panel B here, the second period price for the slightly, by the way, for the horizontal axis, we set phi b to 1. So when phi equals to 1, that means symmetric platform. When phi is bigger than 1, that means A is better than platform B. So when the two platforms are really asymmetric, the market power for platform A is much bigger in the second period, and that's going to hurt consumers. It also corresponds to the effort platforms exert in the first period. The better platform actually is going to charge a lower price, exert a lot more effort because of the data feedback effect. And that's going to lead to a market concentration that we were talking about. Now let's have a quick run through of the various policies within the framework. So GDPR, CCPA, those will be data protection policy. And one important element of that is that users can opt to contribute their data to the platform. Right? So we basically give users the discretion, but because the compensation for data has a one-to-one map to the price that platforms charge. So this type of privacy protection policy is not going to resolve the inefficiency. It's actually going to be the same as our baseline. What about open banking or open data initiatives? Well, it turns out that they are only effective when the two platforms are very different. Data sharing is going to reduce the gap. But if the two platforms are not very disparate, what's going to happen is that data sharing is going to lower the incentive for platforms to invest in infrastructure and also lower the incentive to underprice in the first period to generate more data. And this could hurt consumers' welfare and also hold up the platforms. We look at the cases where either the platform owns the data and can sell it through a data market. There are many articles working on data intermediaries. That's very important, but here we're just going to assume data intermediaries, if there are any of them, are competitive. Right? So if the users own the data, again, they wouldn't internalize the platform's incentive to invest in infrastructure. But if the platform owns the data, what happens is that platforms are large relative to the users, so they are going to extract all the rent. What about a data intermediary, competitive data intermediary, that's helping the platform to sell and purchase data? Well, intermediaries typically purchase or sell data after the data generated. So they still can't fully internalize the ex-ante incentive of platforms to invest in the infrastructure to generate and collect more data. So inefficiencies would remain. Depending on the policy, some policies would solve one type of inefficiency, maybe the under provision of data, but that at the same time, they typically lead to oversharing of data. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to move to the user union part. Quite intuitively, the inefficiencies are really coming from the fact that users cannot coordinate and they have very little bargaining power. Since we have labor union, we have investor council, committee, so on and so forth, it's quite intuitive to think of a data union or user union in general as a coordination device. And in fact, that's going to help mitigate the inefficiencies quite a bit. In practice, there are already discussions along this direction. Political candidate Andrew Yang has talked about data dividend. In the legal profession, people have been talking about data trust, data commons, data pool. They each has its pros and cons. But in general, there's this idea of coordinating and forming a union among users when it comes to sharing data and getting compensated for that. So we want to model that formally. So the way we do it is a user union can pre-commit or preset a reward rate F for per unit data contribution. And one implementation of user union is user union collects all the data. Platforms can choose to purchase data from the user union, and the proceeds from data sales are going to be distributed pro rata to the users. So user union can maximize user welfare. There are alternative implementations. In the paper, we don't derive the optimal design, but what we do show is actually this figure, which is important, that user union can improve upon existing regulatory policies in terms of user welfare maximization. And we're not showing the total welfare, but it's not going to be less than other policies. What is also interesting is actually, as the two platforms become more asymmetric, user union is going to optimally reduce the effort of investment for the platforms. You can see there's a phase transition in the middle. That means when the two platforms are sufficiently asymmetric, users collectively worry about the market power a platform can gain in the second period. So they actually would reduce the data generation and collection, even though that means they lose some benefit that data can potentially provide in terms of product improvements. In the paper, we talk about a few other items, including kind of data occlusion, where platform B sells all data to platform A when there's a data market and platforms own data. In the interest of time, I'm not going into that. I think there's a few directions we're still exploring. You could imagine using blockchain or smart contracts to have a form of commitment to future pricing in this setting. That could be interesting to explore. Traditional antitrust policies such as breaking up the firm, anti-merger debates would be relevant. While breaking up the platform might solve the problem when the platforms have interoperability, so you don't lose the network effect. It's not quite going to solve this data feedback inefficiency coming from data feedback effect, because when you break up a platform, there are typically two separate entities, and data would have a propriety that's hard to share across. So that's pretty much what we do in the paper. We identify this dispersed nature of data generation and the inefficiencies that's associated, and look at various policies and propose and model user union as a potentially effective solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fantastic talk. As a reminder, we are going to reply to the questions at the end after the discussion. Michael, the floor is yours to discuss Will's paper.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to discuss this really interesting and, as Will said, very new paper with a lot of ideas that are worth thinking about. And as Will said, the paper is being updated dynamically, so is the discussion. So I have adjusted the title to reflect the updated title, just to try to maintain as much relevance as possible. So let's get started then. So the motivation. The modern economy, as I'm sure I don't have to tell people in this room, is an information economy. It's clear data is valuable to firms. It's less clear data sharing is costly for customers, and that's often what's referred to as the privacy paradox that I'll get back to in a bit. There's a lot of heightened concern, especially among regulators, about the role of data and competition. You hear all the time politicians like the SEC talking about competition, whether or not Google or Facebook or now Meta has too much market power. and its effect on consumers. So this paper is certainly very relevant for that. And there's a heightened trade-off that comes with this, which is that you get improved products and experiences for customers when you have more data. You can learn more about their taste. You can design better products. But there's a potential for reduced competition and stifled innovation. And this can harm consumer choice and/or privacy. And the paper is going to think a little bit about both. So regulatory response has been local solutions to a global problem, which has been rather frustrating. This is not just necessarily about data sharing or competition. It's also about things like crypto, that these are inherently global platforms. And you see that the regulation that's coming out is thought at a very local level. And I'm giving some examples with regards to data privacy. Some of them complement Will's list. I added a few that he didn't mention, such as the GDPR in Brazil. But you kind of get the idea that you have a lot of regulations that try to tackle the same issue, but come at it with different levels of strictness and different requirements. So these different regulations have different degrees of individual rights and protections. And from casual discussions with companies, I find that with uncertainty, firms tend to just conform to the strictest regulation. And this is particularly problematic. Also, it relates to competition. For instance, Meta is in a lot of discussions with the EU about possibly pulling out because of concerns about moving its data back to the US for EU customers, which the GDPR does not allow. So it's definitely something to think about, is importance of crafting the right policy response, which is what this paper is going to think about. So what does this paper do more specifically? We're going to have a two-period hoteling model of firm competition. Firms are going to be able to collect user data and innovate across periods through this investment in data production. But innovation is also a source of market power via markups. And you have it amplified by network effects. So if people are already part of one platform, that gives more benefit to each user on the platform. And you get this sort of increasing returns to having more people on the platform, which reinforces market power. And also inherent differences in data processing abilities. That was the fee A versus fee B in the model. Data, which is a key property of data, is that it's non-rival, can be shared freely across firms. It does require a cost to collect from users, so they pay that QX, where X is indexing the platform, and an investment to structure. That's that E effort that the platform is going to exert. Data, however, is competitively priced by users who do not internalize all the externalities. They're atomistic. They don't take any of this into account. They just think about their own privacy trade-off when deciding whether to share their data. So the paper is going to examine a variety of data sharing schemes on user welfare, which is great because we have all of this in one paper to be able to really think about it as a laboratory. So from a regulation perspective, you have privacy regulation. You have mandated data sharing, which Will likens to open banking. You have market-based solutions, so users sell their data, firms own and can sell their data to each other. And you also have the novel approach of organized data sharing, which is the user union, user data trust that Will talked about at the end of the talk. So what are the paper's key insights? So there's an inherent tension between investment and market concentration. So firms want to initially invest a lot in underprice to gain market share. We would see that also with an entry model between two firms. An incumbent has an incentive to underprice to gain market share against an entrant. Here we're seeing this occurring between two platforms that internalize that getting users attached to them and getting data is valuable for competition in the second period. So any initial technological taste asymmetries are going to really be amplified. That's one thing I really took away from this. The more different we are, the worse some of these trade-offs of like market concentration become. So data through quality improvements and network effects can lead to winner-take-all dynamics. I'm just citing another paper that kind of thinks a little bit about this, although they have a very extreme conclusion, which is just essentially that if you become the better platform, you can get everyone, and that may have feedback effects to, for instance, the choices available to consumers in the long run. So customers do not internalize any of these data externalities, as I mentioned before. The cost of acquiring data just passes on as a higher marginal cost to consumers through a higher price. It's exacerbated by that non-rivalry of data. There's increasing returns that my one piece of data can be used by many platforms to improve their production. And the proposed regulatory market-based remedies are insufficient, and this seems a bit surprising at first. You would think privacy regulation empowers the consumer, but no, the consumer doesn't fully internalize things. That doesn't always help. You can get underinvestment in data, so we're going to think about how these regulations interact with the two trade-offs. So mandated data sharing and customers selling their data can lead to an underinvestment in data because of a public goods problem. that you're essentially paying the fixed cost for the data acquisition of both platforms. And the exacerbation of market power with firm data sales, because essentially the firms can bargain with each other in the second period and just have this sort of winner take all that's fairly priced as a compensation to the other platform. Extract the most surplus, but who ends up actually getting the consumers will just be an outcome at the second period. And so these things are insufficient. So what we're going to do, we're going to think about what happens with labor unions negotiating with labor. We're going to think about users coordinating like a labor union. And that's going to be the novel solution of the paper that shows actually can mitigate a lot of these frictions and tensions. So given that I've been given a fair amount of time, very generous for a discussant, I'm going to kind of broaden the discussion and then come back to the paper, broadening the discussion in terms of looking at some of the assumptions underlying the paper's construction of the model. So if you know at all my work, or if you don't, what I would say is I care a lot about that C term that comes into the model, which is the cost of data sharing. And it's actually extremely nuanced. And I think personally that a lot of people in the macro space have not thought a lot about this in terms of how nuanced it can be. Of course, this is just my opinion. I may be wrong on this assertion, but the cost in the model is intrinsic. It's disutility that's fungible with the consumption payoff. There's a constant marginal cost, and other models say it's increasing. Others say it's decreasing. The Ichihashi kind of says it's like addiction. So the more data you've shared, the lower the marginal cost of sharing your email when they already know your phone number and name. So depending on the type of setting, we might think that actually the marginal cost of privacy might move around. And also in the model, it's independent of what data is collected. I mean, that's a bit unfair because the model is meant to be stylized and simple, and it scales and how the data is used when it's shared between firms. That's the ADA modification to the cost. So I would say, though, that the cost in practice is actually quite extrinsic. It depends a lot upon the application and the platform being shared with, and likely more nuanced. So individuals' value of privacy is mutable and highly context dependent. So Acquisti et al. Construct a survey, and they showed that just by changing the phrasing of the questions, they can get people to share certain types of data they wouldn't otherwise. There's a well-known disconnect between privacy preferences and privacy actions. This is the so-called privacy paradox. So Athey et al. Shows that in a survey, people care a lot about withholding or protecting their data, but they're willing to give up their email address for a slice of pizza. So very low actual cost when people take privacy actions in practice. And then Chen et al., which is a recent paper using Alipay data, shows that actually those who care the most about privacy are also the ones that use the services. So these are not the people who are necessarily opting out of platforms. These are the people who are using them that have the highest cost of privacy. And I would say getting cost right is important for policy implications. You could say the colloquial terms, it's like a Lucas critique, but I do think it kind of depends a lot upon the specific question we're asking. And I would argue that this differentiates privacy costs from like labor disutility, which has often been modeled as being akin to, because it's very dependent on the context and the platform being used. So the cost of data are very heterogeneous and manipulable. I'll give you just two statistics. So in a Growth for Knowledge survey from 2017, 25% of US survey respondents said they were willing to share personal data for benefits and rewards to compensate them, compared to 35% in China, 8% in Japan. So people from China are much more willing to share their data in return for conveniences. For instance, Google gives you free email, WeChat gives you the ability to chat, Alipay the access to being able to pay with a lot of different merchants. And in contrast, Japan is a bit more strict than the US. They're much less willing to share their data. So you see a lot of heterogeneity across cultures and across the globe. And what's a bit more disconcerting is that platforms also realize that people's concern for privacy is manipulable. So a simple user interface manipulation can increase data protection plan acceptance rates by 228%. So how does this relate? Well, what the authors do is they conduct a survey. They ask you, how concerned are you about privacy? And then based on your privacy score, they're going to tell you, how much data protection do you need? And you can buy a plan for them. It's a fictitious plan, but it's structured to look like a real data privacy plan. And what the authors do is no matter what you do, they tell you you have heightened data concerns. So no matter if you don't care, if you care a lot, they tell you you have heightened privacy concerns and you need the most expensive plan possible. And that type of manipulation, called dark patterns, increases acceptance 228%. So this is something to kind of think about, as firms can also influence the cost of privacy. And there have been several micro foundations for privacy examined in the literature. So there's price discrimination. I would say that's the most popular one. And that's a bit related to market power in terms of raising the price of goods for the consumer using data. There's data security by Feinmeister, Galeotti, and Mamad have this nice paper where they show that data breaches can provide a micro foundation for users caring about their data. I mean, of course, this is a bit heterogeneous across the type of security breaches. Zomato's security breach a few years ago, it was just username, email, and password, not that big a hack. Everyone pretty much has your email at this point. Versus Equifax, where you have used not only names, but you have personal addresses, driver's licenses, social security numbers. So there's also heterogeneity in terms of the concerns for data security based on the platform. And that's kind of why the cost is extrinsic. Some of my work, as well as work by others, thinks about vulnerability. So consumers may not be rational and may be tempted or influenced to buying or doing things they wouldn't otherwise. And then there's surveillance and legal liability, which I didn't really think about before the recent ruling with Roe v. Wade, just because there's a lot of news articles now about whether or not surveillance can be done using women's health apps. And that kind of made me think, well, in certain communities, there may also be this concern of privacy for legal reasons. So the latter three motivations can actually induce a deadweight loss in welfare versus just the redistribution. And I think that might be important because when we look at user welfare, it's true that's one metric. But if at the end of the day, the allocative efficiency is higher, then we can use maybe taxes and redistribution of a larger pie. Versus if there's actually a deadweight loss that comes with data sharing, that's a bit harder to address and maybe viewed as a source of harm. So this maybe introduces a role for privacy regulation or user unions to also think about cases where allocative efficiency may go down because of harm done to consumers. So this is a bit of a question of what's the right welfare objective. I agree user welfare is great for thinking about harm to different communities, but whether or not this is a societal issue also has to think about the big picture. And just to show you a bit about this issues of vulnerability, so I do a lot of Google searches for crypto because I'm in the crypto space. So my Instagram thinks I'm a very unsophisticated, naive investor looking for things to put my money. And maybe based upon a little introspection, I found this article, which just shows that crypto scams are spreading fast on this social media platform. Spoiler alert, it's Instagram. And so this is a bit predatory in this case because you can see Americans have lost about $1 billion to just crypto scams since the beginning of 2021. And this goes along a wide gamut. I get all sorts of offers for venture capital, investing in art, and I'm assuming that they're expecting you to be able to buy these things because my Google searches would suggest I'm not very sophisticated with investing. So just thinking about the microfounding the cost of privacy and taking that seriously, I think is something that is worth pursuing, not just for the paper, but in the future for research more generally. So the second assumption, which I really like about the platform, is that there's a lack of commitments with data sharing. Firms in the model cannot commit to a data usage policy, neither can firms in practice. And we've seen that with Facebook repeatedly changing its data policies over time. You have beacons, the Beacon program launched in 2007. In 2008, there was a term of service update that Facebook said it could own all of your content on the site and do whatever it wanted with it. That triggered a lot of backlash. But also Facebook kind of said, yeah, we're collecting your data, but we're not really using it in any sort of way to profit. And of course, this led to the FTC suing Facebook. And you have a settlement in 2011 for Facebook violating its own privacy promises. So there's certainly a lack of commitment among these platforms, and that's a serious issue. Another context is Amazon engages this with merchants. So what happens is it collects data about which products sell, and then it just creates its own Amazon warehouse where it only chooses to hold the products that are most profitable. That's bad because merchants pay the data acquisition cost of holding all of these different goods without knowing which one is most profitable, and Amazon gets that information for free. So this has been a well-known practice for the last few years, but of course, Tomata Lapan and Kirpalani have a paper that kind of examines the theoretical considerations of this, of these copycat practices. So firms can't commit not to misuse or abuse data, and thinking about regulation is really important for these reasons. The lack of commitment also suggests that firms may also benefit from a commitment device, ex ante. So an alternative to those privacy regulation market-based solutions, maybe the user union can act kind of like this, or I might argue it's a novel role for recent innovations in the crypto space. And this is kind of brings back, why should macro people care about the crypto space? It's, $1 trillion, maybe it was 3 trillion a few months ago. But I think there are interesting innovations that will survive the speculation frenzy going on now, and perhaps it interacts with macro in the sense of thinking about data sharing. So you have smart contracts, and Chad and Leandres have a paper that thinks about smart contracts and competition. Decentralization, there are other papers. Mine is the one I know, that's why I'm putting it there. There's also a role for privacy preserving currencies. So Gerald and Lee have a paper where they say, well, if a currency does not reveal transaction data by the way it's constructed, such as on a blockchain that's not publicly visible, like the government, like a CBDC, that can help to preserve privacy for consumers. So decentralized platforms may also be akin to representation by a user, because the way that these platforms, when they're decentralized, achieve consensus is that you vote based on your holdings within the currency. So if users are holding the currency as well, and they're having voting rights, then at some level, it's like they have representation. So that may also represent a way that a user union could be implemented in practice. So I was really interested in this idea of user unions, so I Googled around a bit, and actually there is one in the crypto space. It's called Streamer, and you can see there's a little icon for data unions down here. And this, I'll come back to one of my last comments, that basically what a user can do is create a smart contract, invite other users to join, and then use that smart contract to then negotiate with demanders of data. So this is a kind of a novel platform, kind of new. I was investigating it. I didn't join it, but I think it's something we're thinking about, and perhaps a little bit prescient that Will was thinking about this as you see these innovations are actually being developed. So something else to think about is data sharing and competition. So I just want to gauge time on here. What's my time look like?
Well, maybe at most 1 minute.
Okay, that's good. So 1, maybe 2 minutes. I'm pretty much at the end. I only have 2 slides left. So data sharing has a nuanced relation with competition. I'm not going to go through the examples, but I just wanted you to get the idea that it's a little bit context dependent. As I was trying to form my own understanding of how competition affects data sharing, you can find a paper with the reverse results very easily. It's very nuanced. So I think it'd be helpful for the paper to help us understand which firms this mechanism helps explain. And I think this is true of any paper that writes on competition and data sharing. Is this about Apple versus Google, or is this more specialized like storage versus Filecoin? Just to get an idea of what we're thinking about. And there's also, it may be able to speak to concerns of ring fencing and interoperability. Is it optimal to impose a cost of switching, which Will could investigate? Should you add a cost of switching, would that improve or harm user welfare? And that's kind of what Apple and Microsoft and Meta do. They make it very hard to switch platforms. So also, what happens if we start from a position of data entrenchment? I would argue we're already kind of in a bad equilibrium. You have Amazon, Google, Apple, Tesla. They're already leaders of big data. Maybe we should also have some discussion of how to remedy the unequal landscape. And then my final point, and this is it, is just how to think about implementing user unions. So labor unions make a lot of sense because they're tailored to workers that sell similar goods to firms. So we have an auto workers, we have a Starbucks, we have Amazon. They're very specific to the application at hand. And I don't think a labor union would work if it's all workers in the world or all workers in the US. So there's conceivably significant heterogeneity in the value and valuation of data. For instance, I don't value my social security number at all. My have you been pwned page, or my have I been pwned page is so filled that it's basically just a history of past data breaches. Like I'm in every major data breach for the last 5 years, so I don't put as high a value on some things as others who may have not experienced such breaches. There's likely a role for many data unions in practice. You can also potentially overcome this monopoly pricing result that's kind of depressing, that if I already have 99% of users' data, the marginal cost of data or marginal price of data for that last guy is 0. With a user union, you can kind of defeat this sort of monopoly pricing that these 2 papers talk about. And then finally, how would user unions interact with regulation? And this is a bit cheap, but I was just thinking about, because a lot of work has been done about unions recently, what happens if there's like a digital right to work or a right to share that could compromise it? So these are just some things to think about. It was a very interesting paper to read, and hopefully I've given Will some things to think about. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for the great discussion. While we're collecting more questions from the audience, Will, would you like to spend 1 or 2 minutes to respond to Michael's discussion?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much, Michael, for the discussion. All the points are well taken. You're absolutely right. I think there are more nuances to modeling privacy. That's something I think even with reduced form, we have some flexibility, so we can try to incorporate some of the dimensions that you mentioned. Even for data type, I think there's this paper by Hagel and Wright. They model within user versus cross-user type of data, and they would lead to different consequences. And then I'm glad that you are on board with the kind of a data DAO idea through blockchain and crypto implementation. There's been a few attempts, and I think hopefully the model offers some insights for designing the fees there and customization of user union in practice. Thank you. We'll definitely explore that dimension.
So Gustavo has asked a question. I think Will has already responded to it, but Gustavo, if you would like, you can follow up on the question.
Yeah, I mean, I maybe I missed this. I was wondering in terms of the stickiness assumption, like my decisions to share my data are extremely sticky. Like I never go back and then revise whatever I said I would share, and I never close out an account. So my point was mostly like data can be reused in a way. I mean, Google and Facebook probably have the same data about me. And therefore it's not partitioned in a way. Like I don't need to say I'm only giving this fraction of my data to this company and this other fraction to another company. So in what sense does that kind of affect or influence your results?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's going to be one parameter in the model. The default is the data is only shared with the platform, right? But once you introduce the data market, you let the users decide whom to share with. They can actually share the same data with both platforms. So that's something we do. And that actually increases the privacy cost because there's probability of leakage on both platforms. Yeah, so that's captured somewhat, but of course it's in reduced form. I think there might be more nuances to that. Yeah.
Caroline, you also asked a question. If you want, you can follow up on your question. So this question was about that this is only using 2 platforms. So what would happen if there would be more than 2 platforms in this market?
Yeah, so we model 2 platforms definitely for tractability and simplicity, and also kind of following the literature in IO. But I think oligopoly would work as long as users have some heterogeneity in terms of preferences for the platforms. So it's not perfect hands-on computation, and also the platforms are relatively large compared to the users, and that's going to create similar inefficiencies in the setup.
Okay. One question that I have is about the 2-period model. Do you think if you had a dynamic model that would somehow affect your results, like multiple periods?
Yeah, so I think qualitatively, the 2-period model captures the main inefficiencies and phenomena. Quantitatively, it's going to affect, I think some of the effects are going to be more gradual. For example, there wouldn't be a sudden switch in terms of what user union would prefer, and the kind of the underpricing, and also the effort would be more gradual from first period to second period, instead of seriously underpricing, then suddenly switching to really squeezing the users. But I think in terms of key mechanism, the 2-period model seem to capture that already.
Unfortunately, we are going to run out of time, so we will come back to the other questions in our panel discussion. So please stay here if you would like to be promoted to a panelist. I just would like to point out that we will have a summer break in July, and our next seminar will be in August on the 25th. It will actually be me talking about a new work in the term structure space. And we very much look forward to seeing you then again. And please stay online if you would like to be upgraded to a panelist.